You're hearing it on both sides. Everybody's talking about how the other side is corrupt. Who do you believe, and what methods should be taken for these guys to be held accountable?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think what we're seeing in the country today, the political tumult on the left, right, and center, is precisely to your point. The fact that there is distrust. I don't think there's distrust in the system as much as there's a distrust in the leadership and how they have manipulated the system. I think a lot of people recognize that the founding fathers gave us this powerful system that diffused power, that made sure that power would not be concentrated. They like that system. The problem is that there is, in a sense, a consensus in Washington, D.C. A lot of people don't realize that. There's a consensus in Washington, D.C. on these corruption issues. What do I mean? What I'm saying is that bipartisanship is not dead in Washington. Most people on the right and on the left that are in positions of authority in Washington, D.C. generally agree to the ground rules of how what I call legal graft occurs in Washington. They accept the fact that members of Congress have family members that are lobbyists, even if they're not qualified, and that those family members get paid because of the position of authority that their mother or father might have as a member of Congress. They all know it's corrupt, but the ground rules are such that they all are benefiting. So there's a consensus that's emerged. They don't talk about it. So what you have is, of course, red states and blue states in America. What you also have is really the rest of America against the Washington Beltway. And that, I think, is underappreciated. And I think one of the reasons that you see a right-left divide is because there are leaders in Washington who don't want there to be a consensus on this issue. I find lots of times, whether I go on Fox News or whether I go on Wisconsin Public Radio, which is left of center, by and large, they grouse and they're concerned about the same thing, about corrupt leadership. They might be pointing the finger in a different direction, but they're talking about corrupt leadership. And what we need to have is a consensus. Number one, term limits. I know it's been discussed many times, but if you look at the corrupt behavior that involves elected officials in Washington, D.C., it's almost to a person. The longer they stay in power, the more they become seduced by power, the more prone they are to engage in corrupt behavior. So if you've been in Congress for 30 years, the odds are infinitesimally higher that you're going to engage in corrupt or extorted behavior than if you've been there for 3 years. Term limits would be a great way to start. Second of all, a ban on lobbying by members of Congress and their immediate family members. This is a position that has been supported by everyone from AOC on the left to Ted Cruz on the right. There's another consensus point that I think would be enormously helpful, because you would get away from this self-enrichment model where elected politicians feel that they are entitled. They're doing great service to the country. They're irreplaceable, but they're not paid enough. They're not appreciated enough. So it's okay to engage in this sort of legal graft where their son or daughter suddenly becomes a highly paid lobbyist, even though they have absolutely no expertise. There are areas of consensus. The problem is the left-right divide prevents us, I think, from going forward and addressing some of these issues.
That's powerful. The term limits and the ban on lobbying members of Congress, as well as family, both AOC and Ted Cruz agree on that. So who doesn't want those two to pass, both term limits and ban on lobbying? Who are the people both on the left and the right say, no, we're not good. We don't want to pass that?
Well, I think a lot of them. I think if you had a open discussion where they were candid, most elected officials would be opposed to those pieces of legislation. The problem that they have is that both of those are supported by 89% of their constituents. So the point is, they don't want to have a debate and a discussion about it. When the issue of insider trading by members of Congress came up, a bill on that matter had been introduced years before, and they had maybe 15 sponsors. Once it became public, once it reached critical mass, once the American public, left, right, and center, became outraged and it became an issue, you suddenly went from having 15 sponsors to more than 300 in the House of Representatives. Why did they do that? They did it because they felt they needed to do it, or they were going to offend enough constituents whereby they wouldn't be reelected. So the issue here on term limits and the ban on lobbying, the real critical issue is therefore for there to be a consensus enough to where elected officials fear that issue and feel like they have to vote for it or they're going to lose their jobs. Otherwise, it's very difficult to get most members of Congress to do something that's going to end up affecting their ability to enrich themselves and their family.
Peter, can you give some names of who's against it and who's for it? You just gave two names, AOC and Ted Cruz. That would be for banning lobbying. But who's against, let's keep term limits the way it is. Let's keep lobbying the way it is. Can you give us an idea which camp is which camp?
Well, I would look at the leadership of the House of Representatives, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Steny Hoyer. Both of them have been in Congress for decades, have never been in favor of term limits. Their view, which I think is wrong, is that somebody who's been in Congress has a certain amount of expertise that's needed. I don't think that's true at all. I think there are many qualified people that can come in and take their positions. I think if you look at the U.S. Senate, you have the same thing. I mean, there's a reason Senator Mitch McConnell has not brought a term limits to the floor and has not want to have it discussed. So again, look at the people who have been in Congress for 20 or 30 years. They become accustomed to it. And the founders didn't really intend this. Initially, to be in the Senate and to be in the House of Representatives, the first 100 years of American history was kind of seen as a burden. It was kind of seen as something you did as an obligation to your community, your state, and to your country. You're somebody who had success in farming or as a printer or as a, raising horses, whatever it was. You ran for office, you served for 1 or 2 terms, and you went back to what you did before. Really beginning in the 20th century, this idea of a career politician where you could do good and do well, where you could enrich yourself by Congress, that is a relatively new phenomenon in the United States and a very, very dangerous one. So I would look at, probably 75% of both political parties in Washington, D.C. in elected office would not want those bills to pass. But I would also say that the vast majority of them would vote for it if they believed that their constituents were fed up and wanted those pieces of legislation to pass.